against a couple of other metrics so that we can look to think about how we're aligned, how we're structured operationally and financially going forward. So when we look at, for example, teachers per 100 students, and we ask ourselves some questions about where we sit a little bit in the lower end of teachers per 100 students in this relatively small cohort, but we will also look to compare ourselves against the larger cohort of other districts. Next slide. However, by comparison, we tend to have more paraprofessionals than other districts in our cohort. So that's something to look at. How are we aligned to properly meet the needs of our students as it relates to staffing, whether it's paraprofessionals or teachers? So as we move down this path of budgeting, we're going to continue to look at that, and as we look forward, we'll consider some of those things in our budget. So then we look at leadership. And you can see where Hamden-Wilbraham falls relative to some of the other districts. Interestingly, Dighton-Rehoboth doesn't seem to report any school leaders, which is kind of odd. If you look at the darker column up top, I'm expecting that that's maybe an error in reporting by Dighton-Rehoboth. They must have principals and people like that. I'm assuming it's built into their district instructional leaders number. It's just an error. But looking at this graph, we do, as we try to speak to a lot, in terms of district administration, we fall at the low end. I think we've shared information on that before. We still fall in the low end of district-wide leadership and district-wide administrative costs. Then when we look into student support, we seem to match the state, but we spend a little bit more in terms of staff per 100 students in student support. Student support staff includes counselors, BCBAs, OTs, occupational therapists, PTs, physical therapists, and a few other groups. So when we look at this, we have the most among our cohort, something worth thinking about and considering again as we move forward. So as we begin to talk a little bit about our actual budget, rather than just comparing ourselves against other districts, we have some major budget increases in the upcoming year. Those budget increases total roughly $2.5 million. You will see later our total budget is in the $2.3 million range. There are some offsets and some small decreases in areas, but most of our budget is made up of pretty significant increases this year. You'll recall in past years, we've had some areas where we had some good fortune, where we had some items even decrease in cost year to year. This year, we're looking at pretty much all of our costs going up. Contractual salaries is always a big piece of our total pie. We negotiated new contracts with all 5 of our bargaining units. All of those, they typically didn't all come to an actual percentage increase, but when we look at the net increase, our net increase on all of our bargaining units combined is probably in the 3% range when we consider salaries. Out-of-district costs, I think we've shared this a number of times. Our cost for out-of-district students has gone up tremendously in the past few years. We've had increasing needs for many of those students. We've had students move in to the district, and additionally, I think we've shared the Operational Services Division of the state has authorized a 14% increase for private out-of-district placements. Those are our most costly placements. Many of those placements cost us between $100,000 to $200,000 a year per student. So that gets really challenging. We're talking about 14%. You will see, I believe, it's the very next slide. I will skim through it very quickly, but this is the actual letter from OSD indicating that 14% increase. But going back to the slide I was just on, health insurance, I'm somewhat happy to say that we really pushed Scantic Valley to keep our health insurance lower this year. I think you'll recall we were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars last year in health insurance increases. This year we kept Scantic Valley to a 2% increase. Hopefully that's helping your towns as well, but it's definitely helping us in terms of mitigating the total increase. Strategic plan impacts, you saw that already. Utilities, 2 slides ahead, you will see an article. If Aaron could go to it very quickly. On utility costs, I think we all know the price of oil and many of the key impacts to energy costs, whether it's oil, natural gas, electricity, have gone up tremendously this year. So we are struggling with that. We are looking at about a 10% across the board increase to our energy costs. For those of you who are wondering, I have normalized electricity costs to 2019 levels for Minnetonka. So I went back 3 years, to make sure I was using some numbers and factored up a bit for inflation. Knowing that the lights have been on here for some time, I didn't want to leave the towns accountable for the lighting issue in the 2024 budget. So I did my best to sort of wipe that out. One of our ongoing challenges for the past couple of years has been our substitute costs. I shared at a school committee meeting, I believe last month, that our average total substitute days pre-COVID were a little over 3,000, about 3,100. Last year, our total substitute days were 5,500. So every one of those substitute days is a substitute we're paying for, and that increases our substitute costs substantially. This year, as of early January, we were over 2,800 total substitute days. I'm expecting we'll be in the neighborhood of 6,000 total substitute days. So we will have almost doubled our total substitute days. There's some question, are we still living in a COVID world of some sorts? Are people still having to quarantine a little bit or take more time off? I'm a member of a number of human resources groups that banter back and forth online about this. There are some people who think, yes, that's the case. There's others who think some of this is a little bit of the new normal, that people are going to continue to take more time off when they're sick. And COVID has actually changed not just the short term, but it will change the long term and how people utilize time. So, we're hoping that maybe it dips a bit, but we are expecting that in the long term, our substitute days will be higher than they have been in the past. We did get relatively favorable numbers on transportation. LPVEX total budget increase was not as high as we'd imagined. Last year, they had a pretty significant increase. This year was smaller. We are considering the need for some in-district special education programming. That is to meet some of those needs. So when we talk about the total special education costs increasing, this is a factor in that in order to keep students in district and meet the needs of existing students, we are having to increase services a little bit in this area. Hampden County retirement charges, I think I spoke a little bit to the cost of retirement. Last year we absorbed a 9.25% increase. This year we're absorbing somewhere over a 5% increase in Hampden County retirement charges. So, as a dollar value, this doesn't look huge, but on a percentage value, it adds up very quickly when we're speaking about our budget. So as we move on, I've spoken about the OSD 14% increase. Another point worth mentioning is that OSD also approved a 4.5% increase for virtual schools. So these are virtual choice schools that have no overhead costs in terms of facility costs. They have no transportation costs. They have limited energy costs. Yet they still, the state still managed to give them a guaranteed 4.5% increase. So we're looking at major components of our budget for other people who do more or less what we do, educate students that have gone up by 14% and 4.5%. Next item, utilities. I'm hopeful that 10% is where we're going to be. We do have some solar credits in this building that did save us a lot from the lighting issue, and we're hopeful that those solar credits will continue to ramp up as costs go up. So we're hopeful that that will mitigate a little bit. So as we look at the budget for this year, I think some of you will recall who were in some of our earlier meetings that we were significantly over 6% when we began this course. We started working on figuring out how some of the components fit together. We've received a little information from the state that wasn't tremendously promising. But at this point, we're at about a 4.5% budget with almost all of our inputs in place. So almost all of our factors are accounted for. I wouldn't think that for a level service budget that we would be able to get much below this. So anything we would do outside of this would be taken away from level service at this point. Oh, yes. We will be reducing a few ESSER positions. So in COVID, coming out of COVID, we have hired some additional adjustment counselors and BCBAs to help support social emotional needs. Some of those positions will end at the end of this year. That's part of our ESSER plan, and we were prepared to do that from the beginning. You will recall last year I provided a bit of a comparison between West Springfield and Hamden-Wilbraham. This is very much the same, only updated a little bit. One of the challenges that we face is that we are in a hold harmless position with Chapter 70, which is state aid. This has been an ongoing issue due to our number issues, with numbers dropping. So if you look at this comparison, West Springfield started out a little bit bigger than us. They have maintained enrollment, right? They've only lost 100 students in the past 15 years, whereas we've lost about 800 students in the past 15 years. And at that same time, their total percent difference in Chapter 70 aid has gone up by 53.61%. Ours has grown by 7.4%. So in 15 years, that's roughly 0.5% per year. And that's very typical with what we received. Last year was actually a good year, and that is represented in these numbers. So typically we receive between $25 and $30 per student in additional Chapter 70 aid, which is frequently below 0.5%. So that then becomes incumbent upon the towns to make up that difference. So when we're talking, you'll see later, when we're talking about a 4.5 budget, that means significantly higher increases to the town's assessments. It's just the reality of the situation we're in, with many of our inputs being flat. Interestingly, today I received a list of school districts receiving Chapter 70. So we've had a lot of commentary about who gets Chapter 70 aid, who doesn't get Chapter 70 aid, the results of the Student Opportunity Act and things like that. So this list came in and is very interesting. I sorted it according to percent change, but I also look at dollar per student change. And when we talk about it, we assume that many of the big urban districts, some of the gateway districts are the districts that are going to get most of the Chapter 70 aid. Very interesting, 3 of the top 30 recipients of aid on both a percentage basis and a per student basis are Martha's Vineyard, Oak Bluffs, which is on Martha's Vineyard, and Tisbury, which is on Martha's Vineyard. Other big winners include Barnstable, Norwood, Stoneham, Stoughton. These are not the towns we expect. You will see none of the big districts that we typically talk about are in the top 30. Most of them are below the top 60 school districts, in terms of percent and dollars per student. So I thought that was very interesting, you know, just reflective of the schools receiving this aid. Lexington is relatively high on the list. They're in the top 50. Just thought it was interesting, and I thought it sort of changed a little bit what goes on in my mind when I think about the schools that are getting large increases in Chapter 70 aid. These school districts are getting that aid on a per pupil basis, so whether their numbers are increasing or decreasing is not relevant. They're getting a very large increase. Some of them I talked about, we're getting $25 to $30 a student. Barnstable is getting $1,100 per student in aid. Tisbury on Martha's Vineyard is getting $1,700 in aid per student. You know, you can keep going down the list. It's very interesting, and I don't know sort of the rhyme or reason to it, but I thought it kind of changed the narrative a little bit.
Aaron, is that hold harmless applicable to all districts or just regional districts?
It is technically it's applicable to all districts. That any district, no district receives less aid than they received in the prior year. And then if you were in a case where you would receive less than $25 to $30 per student, it varies depending on what legislature wants to do. Last year, they actually, because of COVID, bumped it up to $60 per student, so there's a little windfall there. We're not talking huge money in any of these cases. You know, $60, we would need to receive $100 or more per student to make it start to become really meaningful.
So does that mean that those districts, those top receiving districts you just referenced, they're having an increase in their enrollments?
No, in some cases they're not. I don't, the formula is very complicated. It has a little bit to do with community wealth. It also has a little bit, it has pupil enrollment, low income, ELL costs, things like that. So it figures out, say, an average cost per student. Then it takes income factors into account. Then it takes other factors, special education needs, low income needs, and I think there are a couple other factors built into that. It's all built into kind of a per student model. Right.
Something's clearly out of whack because those towns that you referenced
right.
are doing reasonably well.
Right. So when I sort of created this list, there are a couple districts that are very high on this list. For example, you know, Hancock with 86 students. I know that one family moving into that town will change everything drastically when you have 86 students. So they're actually, you know, one of the very top on this list, but a very, you know, a few students changes that dynamic very distinctly. But Barnstable has, you know, 5,200 students, right? So it's a little, the statistics get a little better. Your variance drops significantly when you start to have 5,000 plus students.
I'm just wondering what we have to do to get ourselves on that list.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're spending a lot of money. We want to educate our children as well, and yet this formula seems to work to our disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And try as I might over the years to understand that the inputs is still a mystery to me.
Yes. I think we could have a whole sort of event over a workshop going over the formula, which is very complicated. They have spreadsheets. You can see all the components. The formula, I think we've talked about a lot. To many school districts, it is fundamentally broken in many ways. You know, many of the school districts that have seen population decline, just by the nature, our overhead costs are just going to be higher. We're not utilizing, you know, facilities the way they have. You know, Eastern Mass has schools single schools with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 students in them, right? So that's a big game changer in terms of your overhead costs. You know, we're much more rural. Our buses drive much further, things like that.
It's just the continuing frustration with this the impact of this formula,
Mhm.
it's going to turn into serious consequences in the not too distant future
Mhm.
as these ARPA funds and the ESSER funds start disappearing.
Right.
And, more and more of this burden is going to be shifting to the towns.
Yeah.
Unless that formula changes, there's going to be some serious shortfalls.
I think everyone up here agrees wholeheartedly with that statement. The formula is a challenge.
Question around regional transportation, reimbursement.
Excuse me, just one quick point. Just speak in the microphone, because that's being recorded and they can't hear you. If you just pass it over.
Be a pleasure. I can give you.
Thanks, sir.
Question around regional transportation. It's a reimbursement, but when we get the number from the state, or at least in the governor's budget, is that based on a previous year's cost, or is that just an arbitrary number? Or how does this all fit together? Or do you get a separate reimbursement at some point?
Yep. So the governor puts out a budget, and you will see that the governor, if you go to the cherry sheets, which are online, I'm sure Nick has gone to them, and pull up the governor's budget against what is in the cherry sheets. The governor has about, I want to say $90+ million in regional transportation. If you go to the total cherry sheet for the state, there's only 70,000 listed, or 70 million, I'm sorry. I'm saying thousands, I mean millions, I apologize. I've spoken to DESI about that. They are using incredibly conservative figures right now for that to estimate those numbers. So in our budget this week, in speaking with DESI and understanding that they're using very low numbers for those cherry sheets, which I think is interesting. I compared it against our numbers that I entered. I provide numbers through an end-of-year report, and when I looked at the numbers that were provided to us, those numbers were 75% of what I entered. So that 1,399,000 that's on the cherry sheets is exactly 75% of what I submitted for reimbursement for last year. The interesting part of that, in talking to DESI, they are taking a very conservative view of where that would end up. I'm not sure why and what our transportation would be. So they are literally just taking 75% of my last year's costs and pushing that forward. They will not issue final reimbursement figures until we submit our 2023 end-of-year report, and that reconciles out. It seems like a weird way of doing things. Most other reimbursements just take your last year's number and calculate. They literally, so the number we're using to kind of answer your question, Mark, is a little bit make-believe, to be very blunt about it. I've talked to John, and we've looked at sort of meeting in the middle in terms of what we're putting into our budget. We've taken that 1,399,000, and we're putting 1,550,000 into the budget as our transportation reimbursement figure. I'm very confident that our numbers for 23 will be relatively similar to our numbers last year, plus a small inflationary percent, so 3.5% or so in inflation. And then taking 90% of that, we should surely be at 1,550,000 or more. Anything that we don't say receive, any additional money we receive would roll into E&D. So it would be money again that we can put against the budget the following year.
So it is a reimbursement from the previous year. So any cost increase, we bear the first year of the cost increase.
Yes.
So if it goes down in a subsequent year, we're the benefactor of that.
Yes. Yes. So if we do reduce our transportation costs, we will benefit from that for 1 year, but then we will have to account for it in our reimbursement going forward. So we'll have a 1 year semi-windfall, but then we'll play catch up the following year.
So it's interesting because I think, if you remember, the MASC came back and made a comment. Well, they shared articles about the governor saying that it was going to be a 90% transportation reimbursement, so now hearing what you're saying, so it's not 90% of what they actually owe us, it's 90% of what we paid last year probably. Maybe with a little bit of inflationary cost on it, but it's never gonna be as close to the numbers it's supposed to.
Sure.
I just wondered if Desi, confirmed any of the stuff that she said she was gonna do versus if they're just taking a conservative approach
Yeah.
because she had a
And-
very aggressive budget.
Right, and that, some of the challenge is what is expressed in the cherry sheets versus what is expressed in the governor's budget. So when they put out those cherry sheets, it's actually, when I say it's Desi works with the Department of Local Services to put out those cherry sheet figures. They together take a more conservative stance on things. So they presume that if potentially our transportation numbers do drop tremendously in 2023, which they won't, that we might not get as much as would be predicted. But in speaking with John, we both agree that that is way too conservative for our liking in terms of those numbers that are there. I've not felt like DESI or DLS has been that conservative in the past, so it seemed odd to me to see as significant a drop. Our transportation costs were relatively level between 21 and 22, but if you look at the numbers, what they're projecting for our regional transportation reimbursement drops by, I want to say, $100,000. So it just seems more conservative than it really should be. So I think we're willing to be a hair more aggressive in that regard. You guys are good? Yeah. Okay, I wasn't sure if Joe was gonna jump in. I thought this was, sorry, okay. Next slide, I think this is just a, oh, sorry, Joe.
A couple of detailed questions, actually. First of all, thank you for putting all this together. It's very enlightening, it's very easy to follow and understand.
Thank you.
Looking at the budget, you have a budget going up $2.3 million. I saw the major budget increases, they go up $2.5 million.
Yeah.
Where did you reduce the budget by $200,000? Are there major buckets? Was it small buckets?
Some of it is in offsets. So we are projecting to receive, because of our tremendous special education increases, we are expecting to bring in more circuit breaker reimbursement from the government, from the state. So the state has a program called Circuit Breaker that provides some relief for school districts with high-cost special education students. So we are obligated to spend about the first 50,000, it's in the 48,000 something range. So we spend roughly the first $50,000. Then every dollar beyond that $50,000, we get about 75 cents. So we get 75% of every dollar beyond that. So the reimbursement, for a student who's, $100,000, and I messed up the math on this last time, that costs us $100,000. Again, we pay the first $50,000, and then we get $37,500. I did the math correctly this time. Thank you. We get 75% of that amount. So it's challenging in the sense that we're out a tremendous amount of money. We're out $62,500 on a single student to get $37,500 back.
Okay. So that was the majority of the difference.
That is a majority of that closing of the gap, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
As you move through the presentation, are you planning to go through these major budget increases in any further detail? Because one thing I'd like to do is just review them in more detail. What things are controllable, what things are, minimal, like one's like to have and actual needs. Obviously, when health insurance costs go up, there's nothing we can do about that.
Sure.
So, I look at things like contractual salaries. Is that, are you adding staff, or is that just contractual salary increases based on raises, more raises? Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay. And then when you look at the ad district's costs, there's no change there. There's nothing we can do to impact these costs, correct?
Say again?
The out-of-district costs, is there
Yeah.
anything we can do to control those costs?
Some of what we've been doing is trying to look at programming options in district. So when we have out-of-district costs that are in the $2+ million range, if we can build a program to keep kids in, for $100,000, $128,000 we have here. One of the real challenges is it's really an investment in the future when you're putting a program like that in place. It's very hard to bring students back from an out-of-district placement at times. So the opportunity, you can't add a program and expect to bring back a tremendous number of students. What you're trying to do is close the funnel of the students going out. So we have all these students who come in, some small number do have to go out, and our goal is to tighten that funnel a little bit of students who go out. You know, we do hope to bring a few kids back if we can, but that's, you know, that's not something that's a big expectation.
Okay. And then looking at,
Can I speak to that? Just one more piece. When you look at the out-of-district increase of 488,650, you should bear in mind the OSD increase. You know, essentially what that is the Office of the Operational Services Division sets prices for all the schools, and then districts have to pay whatever that price is. That 14% increase that OSD imposed, I'll say, accounts for $356,000. So that's no difference in services to anyone, creates that inflationary factor there. So you can see more than 3/4 of the out-of-district cost increase is based on this letter from OSD.
Very good point.
thank you. But again, I'm just looking at these costs, looking at some of these things you can't control. And maybe there's future plans to control some of these costs. As you look through further, the strategic plan impact, that is a decision. So really you're asking for, you're saying we need $100,000. That is a want to have or like that or something we feel we need, not something that is.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a whole year of a lot of people's time determining this was the right thing for the community. So I think most of us sitting up here would be very hesitant to want to kind of throw that out the window. You know, we looked at that, and I know John did pull a few items off the table for year one of that plan. So.
Are there any ways we could mitigate some of that cost by using community members again to help with some of those plans? Is there anything we could do to rally up support? We had an overwhelming number of people want to participate. Are those any options that could reduce some of the costs here?
I don't want to speak for John, so I'll kind of let him field that. It's one of the first slides. So,
Yeah. So
you can have that. I'll pass it. Just pretend it doesn't exist.
just going through this, so the curriculum councils, I think, are essential. I mean, one of the realities of the district, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, is we don't have a documented pre-K to 12 curriculum. That is fundamental for the functioning of any district. So I would say that is definitely in the need to have category. The website update, I'll just say, I have gotten constant messages from the community that they'd like our website to be a more vibrant way of sharing information. I don't know if it's going to actually come to $25,000. That's a placeholder. There's a committee now that's working on website modification and update. We are looking at a number of potential vendors. So that price might settle lower or higher. You know, and there is some cost of our website as it currently is, so that would be mitigated against that. So that is a sort of a placeholder, but I do want to recognize that there'll probably some cost in making our website better. The equity audit outcomes, again, that's a placeholder. We don't exactly know what the cost of those are going to be because we're in the process of doing the equity audit right now. In fact, I'm submitting thousands of documents to Madison Insight for our equity audit, and they'll be on site doing interviews with staff, students, and community members at the end of this month, and they'll produce some kind of report. I don't know what the cost of that report will be, but I think it's not going to be zero. I mean, it might be less than $50,000, but I think we need to budget some money to take action on whatever that comes up with.
Okay, thank you.
So if we go down a bunch of slides, 17? Yep.
Aaron, just before you move on to that, just looking at this low income chart.
Yep.
Are these, do these numbers include the choice students, or are these solely residents of the towns?
This, might include choice students.
We have now, what,
Can't be
about
certain.
600 choice students or so in the district?
600?
Isn't that?
No. We have maybe somewhere over 100 at the high school and some scattered, so let's call it.
All right, better than I thought, thank you.
Yeah.
So you think that these low-income numbers include choice?
When I pull the data from DESI's website on all students, those do include choice students for the district. So yes, those would include.
So that would be included in the other towns as well?
It would be included in other towns as well, and all of these towns do to some degree or another accept choice. I know Long Meadow has a METCO program that's more robust than ours.
Okay. Good, thank you.
Yep. Worth noting, you'll see some color shifts. I've added these this year. This is just to delineate that the state has changed how it designates people, students, as either low income, economically from 2008 to 2015, economically disadvantaged from 2016 to 2021, and now back to low income in 2022, and there have been subtle changes to the definitions. As you can see, though, when I parse this out, those percents seem to just continue to rise at similar rates, so I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference and when you're comparing district to state to other districts, but I think it's just worth noting that there is a small difference in how they denote those students. So when we finally get to the next slide and we start talking about assessments, moderate shift increase to each town's minimum local contribution. The interesting thing is this year it was very comparable to the student counts, so it didn't really change anything in terms of how that money broke out. The state is kind of ratcheting up minimum local contributions. It wouldn't hit us until either of you until you start hitting the threshold of what you're paying now, and you'll see that there's a pretty big gap in that. But sometimes you'll recall in past years, we had 1 year when minimum local contribution shifted drastically towards Wilbraham. I think we speculated a little bit on someone possibly winning the lottery in the town of Wilbraham, and that shifting the income base for Wilbraham up significantly, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking of it. But that is what it is. It's the way they calculate it. So each town has their normal transportation assessment. That's a share of the transportation costs. There's a discretionary amount in terms of getting us to the budget. And then each town has a debt assessment. That debt assessment went up by a tiny bit, 0.17%, just based on sort of shifting things. You'll recall that last year we brought down the debt assessment pretty significantly through a bond refinance that was helpful. So we have total assessments, and then I think what's more meaningful to each town is the actual assessments to the town and how those shifted. So the state brought everyone's minimum contributions up by a fair bit, so Wilbraham's minimum contribution went up. But again, it really only would matter if you were bumping up against sort of your total spending. Increase in transportation assessment. Like I said, it wasn't a terrible increase this year. We've had worse. Some of that is, I believe, the split between the towns. Above minimum contribution, how that increase plays out. Subtotal, and then total change, 1.8 million, $1,814,106. That puts us at 6.52%. You'll recall earlier I mentioned that 4.5% increase when you factor in all of the flat items, things like Chapter 70, transportation reimbursement, that's still relatively flat, and then some other factors. It's really hard to keep that from increasing. So when we have a 4 and a 5, this is really what it looks like to the towns. Then when we get to Hamden, the numbers do still shift slightly towards Wilbraham, so there wasn't a huge shift towards Wilbraham this year, but there was a bit of one. So minimum contribution for Hamden went up by 4.86%. Transportation assessment went up by 1.87%. Above minimum contribution would be 9. When we get to a debt assessment, again, very small increase. Total change, an additional $441,766 at 5.35%. So the next slide just gives you a little bit of a visual as to where our funding comes from. You'll see a huge proportion, well over 50%, comes directly from the towns. That 29 million, in fact, that's about 60% of our budget currently. Chapter 70 makes up the, I'm sorry, from Wilbraham. The next piece is Hamden, I'm sorry. I mixed up my graphs. Hamden assessment coming in at 8 million brings that total to 37 million. So that's close to 75% of the total budget. Chapter 70 is the next biggest piece, next to the assessments at 12 million. Transportation reimbursement, excess and deficiency. You'll recall that we brought up our excess and deficiency significantly last year to meet the cut that came at the last minute. We used excess and deficiency to cover for that. We brought that amount down by 100,000 this year, to preserve a little bit of excess and deficiency. We have traditionally trended about 650,000 in the past. We'd like to get closer to that level, trending down over time. Some very small pieces. You'll see interest gets us $35,000 a year. Medicare gets us $275,000 a year in funding. So then where does all that money go? The vast preponderance of it goes to instructional services or other school services, which are student costs. Those are all direct student costs. Staff working with students. When we're talking about fixed costs, we're talking about energy, we're talking about overhead costs of keeping the district going, fuel costs, things like that. You'll see the debt service piece. Out-of-district students are a significant cost. That isn't just special education, that is choice and charter students as well. So that is our total allotment to students who are placed other places. That's 6% of our budget, which is a pretty significant piece. Leadership and admin at $1.3 million. Operations and maintenance at $4.6 million. Finally, we come to the capital needs of the district, and these are separate from our operating budget. We've been talking about these, I think, at school committee meetings. We've shared our capital plan for the elementary schools at each town, elementary through middle, I'm sorry, at each town. We have submitted we've submitted capital requests formally to the town of Wilbraham. Hamden does have our capital plan, and I believe we're meeting with them next week, and we can have conversations about some of that. However, for Minnetonka, I'm seeing some head shaking.
It's the first I've heard. I said it's the first I've heard you're meeting the
We're meeting with the advisory on the 6th, right?
Yeah, it's not capital plan.
Oh, I'm sorry, not capital plan, but advisory. I apologize. My bad.
We don't have anything, we have nothing for Hammond schools.
Okay, I will send you our capital plan. We've shared it with the town of Hamden and such, so
okay.
we'll make sure that's shared. So a couple items, updating wireless access points. This is part of what will probably be a multi-year process of replacing wireless access points. Many of the wireless access points in this building are original to the building. They are 10 years old or more, much like the switches and all of the other technology in this building. They're getting pretty long in the tooth, and it's time to start replacing them. Second floor railings, we have a safety issue in our railings up on the second floor. We've wanted to address that. We've received some engineering specs, and we're prepared to put that to bid. This is a little above what the engineer gave us, but I want to be cautious of inflation and unexpected costs. I think people in Wilbraham will recall the fire alarm system at Stony Hill that became pretty challenging to fund. Classroom projectors and monitors, again, many of our existing projectors, the short throw projectors that are in our classrooms are original to the building. They use bulbs that are expensive, they're breaking more, and many of them are just not usable at this point. We do have some need to upgrade the camera systems in this building and pretty much all of our buildings district-wide. Again, many of the cameras in this building are original to the building. They're showing their age, and they're not as valuable as we would like them to be in terms of collecting evidence. We also have ongoing needs to add mini-split units. As you'll recall, when this building was built, it wasn't built with central air for the entire building. Over the years, we've had many students come in with needs around humidity in the classrooms they're in and temperature in the classrooms they're in. So when it is getting hotter and hotter in late August, early September, or into June, we are having to install mini-split units in classrooms. Mike, how much are they per unit typically? About $6,000 a unit, so this would put in about 5 units. It seems like every year we get a handful of additional requests. They're not as efficient as we like, but they're really the only option to meet the needs of those students that would be obligated to do so. So that total comes to $428,000. You will see the split based on the assessment, the current assessment splits. That is what would be assessed to each town. Right now, I know the question is going to come up, we have $406,000 in the Minichog Capital Stabilization Account, and I know there's an item on the agenda to discuss that. So with that, thank you. And our next meeting will probably be our budget meeting, correct?
Does anyone have any additional questions for Aaron? Does anyone have any questions, additional questions for Aaron?
I had a question, Aaron, back to the mini split. You hear rumors in town and stuff. Is it true that the whole building is ducted for central air, but there's just not central air units for the whole building? Like our mini splits, like are we spending a little bit each year on mini splits, but is there,
Well, it's based on health needs, it's based on the health needs of
But do
doctors that say.
we have ducts for AC throughout the building?
It's size for it, but the chilled water was never brought to the opposite end of the building. That's why all the splits are over there.
that, I guess that's my question, like, is there, I mean, this is not the year for bigger dollar items.
Yeah.
Obviously, nor is the next 5 years, but I'm wondering if, we're dribbling away a lot of money on mini splits, and then, our 5-10 years from now, are we gonna regret that we didn't make the bigger investment to just do the whole building? Because eventually, students with the special needs will randomly disperse and end up hitting every classroom,
So,
by random statistics.
right.
The MSBA wouldn't participate in air conditioning, plain and simple. They would only do special areas and large gathering spaces and this and that. We tried to capture all of the computer areas and sensitive areas that required dehumidification. But in the drawings, they never made it there.
So, really what happens is we have students every year who this is written maybe into their IEPs, or we get, we have ADA issues around it, and we don't have a choice. I mean, we don't, I sometimes say, I live in Amherst, there's a bridge out on Station Road. it's still the bridge that the Army Corps of Engineers put in, right? When that bridge went out. They left it out for a couple of years, you had to go miles around it, and now it's a one-lane bridge the Army Corps of Engineers put in. We can't do that. When a student comes in and they have needs, we have to provide those needs immediately. So when that student has needs, I can't look at $500,000, $1 million to redo the air conditioning. I have to put in mini splits. Like I said, they're not as efficient as we might like as a central air system, but that's just what we have to do to meet the needs of that student. An IEP is a legal contract, and if we're in violation of that, bad things happen.
So we've had scenarios where they go from the elementary to the middle to the high school, so you're chasing the rooms.
No, I mean, I understand it's very important to meet the needs of those students. I'm just wondering if we're gonna end up spending a lot more money in the long run if we, you know, instead of just,
A Band-Aid versus a full fix.
instead of just making the whole building prepared to deal with students with those needs in all of them.
How did
So
you,
Like making,
the short
I
answer to that
understand
is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just to get cut to the chase, right? The short answer to that is yes. If we keep doing this and we do every room that way, that's where we're gonna end up.
Can I just ask, are those mini splits, they follow that student from room?
No, they're
room,
a
or they-
permanent
They're
install.
permanent, okay.
Yeah, so we might have
tried
students,
the
yeah.
portable air conditioners all the way up to 220 volt and the most BTUs and everything, and they complained beyond anything, so we had to go to the mini splits.
so Erin, the only question I have is if you have a student who comes in and say fall and that has that requirement, how are you reimbursing for that? So like, obviously you have to get the mini split, you have to install the mini split.
We are not reimbursed for that.
So, no, but I mean, so you just taking funds from the operating budget at that point to install it and then
From
coming
time to
back and
time, when.
trying to reimburse it from the
when-
budget?
Yeah, I mean, we do our best to pay it, you know, when we've got money in the maintenance budget at the end of the year, if we have the ability to put in 1 or 2 mini splits, we'll try to do it. You know, I think we paid some things from the operating budget at the end of the year, a few years ago. I'd like to stop doing that because of the sort of the blowback of that. So now we're trying to take a more responsible route, and we're trying to share them out. These are the real costs of running the district.
Is this close enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Aaron, I have a couple questions, Aaron. So if we look at the special ed per 100 students, if you add paraprofessionals and educators, we run high, right? We run at 3.7 per
100, yeah.
100.
Back to that.
Freetown Lakeville 3.5, Dyker Home at 3.2, Whitman Hanson 2.6, State 2.9.
Yep.
Do we have a higher population of special ed students? When I look quickly, it doesn't appear that we do. So then the question I have is, what are we doing different? And do we have an opportunity to re-envision how we support special education so we can be more in line with the state average, or at the very least, our cohorts? It's interesting when you read Freetown Lakeville, they plan to add 100 special needs students between K to 5 in this year. What they are adding, as far as I can tell, is 2 paraprofessionals. So when you look at it, it just seems like we significantly dwarf our cohorts and the state when it comes to support in terms of paraprofessionals and students. And that just, to me, begs a lot of questions on how do we do it and could we do something different?
Right. So I'm not 100% sure where we are relative to the state on special education numbers. I think we're pretty close to the state. Yeah. So we are pretty comparable to the state, I believe, the last time I looked. So some of this was to sort of raise exactly those questions that we want to ask ourselves. So you'll notice that back-to-back slides, we have fewer teachers per 100 students, but we have more paraprofessionals.
That's the total that I added up, though. So the numbers I'm giving you are teachers plus paraprofessionals. That's
Okay.
exactly what I did to say, okay, what's the total FTE, if you will, that we are putting per 100 students? And we are, let's call it 0.8 FTEs higher than the state average.
Sure.
Rough math where
Yep.
0.4 higher than our cohorts.
Fair enough. Right, so something to look at. We haven't done more than pull the data and just start asking the questions at this point. So this is, I'll let John go. Maybe more to say.
I can weigh in on that. I mean, what strikes me about this as a former special education director is that we've invested in a model that has a lot of more paraprofessionals and relatively fewer teachers as compared to our cohorts. So I think the question that this asks is, could we flip that dynamic? Could we get to a point where we had more teachers but maybe fewer paraprofessionals in the mix? So that, I think, is a very direct sort of question that emerges from this data.
And it may not be that you flip it. It may say this is more economic model and we're doing it. So I think you need to understand the full cost overall when we're looking at it. The next question, so as we're looking at Whitman Hanson, they allocate non-mandated busing to each member community. What is non-mandated busing, and is that an opportunity that we can look at here?
Non-mandated busing is going to be transporting of students less than a mile and a half from their home. We do transport some students that are less than a mile and a half from their home. Those would be non-mandated. Some districts transport choice students. So they may have a cohort of choice students that are being transported. So some towns literally send buses into neighboring towns to pick up bus loads of their choice students. So that could be part of that non-mandated transportation. So what we're mandated is somewhat limited. Some of the challenge, we've talked a little bit in the past about access to sidewalks. You know, typically if you have a student who's in second grade and has a mile and a half walk to school with no sidewalks, there are many communities that are really going to be thrilled with that. So as we've talked about sidewalks in the past, that could impact the number of students who we're taking on the bus. Now again, I don't think even with sidewalks, a lot of people are wanting a second grader walking a mile and a half, but it at least stretches out the distance you might be willing to consider for students to walk, or to walk to centralized bus stops, as opposed to, you know, house to house in some cases, right? Without sidewalks, it gets harder to pick up kids in group bus stops.
So in theory, we could do it now. The Wilbraham Finance Committee probably wouldn't be happy because the assessment would probably swing incredibly heavy based off the number of sidewalks near elementary schools in Wilbraham than it would to Hampton. So that doesn't really help us where we are right now.
Right.
The other question, when you had mentioned from an out-of-district standpoint that is not just special ed, so what percentage or what is the dollar amount of the 2.916 that is school choice?
I do not have that in front of me. Out of district special education students are costing us, I believe, next year a little over $2 million. So the net difference in that. Let me go to the slide really quick.
So call that.
Yeah, I would have to. I don't. You know, I don't want to give you a number on that right now and be wildly wrong. I believe our out-of-district special education is a little over $2 million. So the difference, say 600,000, 700,000, is in choice and charter largely.
Okay. Now, under the law, we have the ability to opt out of school choice, correct?
We can.
So have we modeled to see, are we making more?
We can't opt out of sending choice. We can only opt out of receiving choice. So those costs will always exist. No matter what we do with a choice on taking school choice, we will have choice out costs.
So if we have $700,000, let's say, in regular choice, we're only spending, or what we are making, right? So we make the deficit between what it costs per pupil here and the $5,000 if it's a regular ed, correct?
Say again, I'm not sure I follow.
So if we're spending $20,000 on a per pupil expenditure, and we're only paying the sending district, or excuse me, the receiving district 5, we make the delta.
Well, so through the traditional school choice program, we're only paying 5,000. So of that, I'm getting back to my remembering, the numbers on my spreadsheet and what I think we shared with choice and charter earlier. I think choice out right now is in the $340,000 range. Particularly when we talk about the virtual choice numbers. I think we talked about that the other week with a 4.5% increase. So if we were to, those are the ones we get the roughly $5,000 per student, with the exception of virtual choice where we spend more. The students who are costing us close to $20,000 per student are charter students. And again, those we can't control, and we can't build our own charter school to take charter students in, so we have no way of taking that $20,000 per student back. It's more like 16, but ballpark.
So have we modeled it to see if we're better off stopping school choice while continuing the students that leave because of what we make, right? So if we're only receiving 5, but we have costs that come from that, and if we look at the students we lose, and we make X,
right?
Have we modeled that to say, we're better off stopping the school choice program outright, taking the advantage that we have here, because it more than pays for itself without putting added resources into the district?
I mean, every year when we look at choice, our biggest choice school is this building right now. The past couple of years when we've talked to Steve Hale, the principal, around maintaining reasonable class sizes, maintaining students in things like AP classes, electives, languages, things like that. It is around maintaining. You'll recall that we are down, I want to say 60 or 70 students, despite taking more choice students in and struggling with options. So having enough students to fill those options, such as AP, such as languages and things like that, is really important.
So it sounds like we didn't model it. We don't know what the number.
We don't have a specific model, but if we were to take away those choice, we would, part and parcel, be needing to take away some options. Okay. We'd be taking away AP, we'd be taking away languages, things like that.
So the other two things, and I think it's
Excuse me, can I just touch on what you just said? So wouldn't that just mean that we have a smaller class size?
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Well, we might not have enough funds to make it economically feasible to run some of those classes. So some of the languages, I think.
To see the numbers, how that would play out, if that, how many kids that would really.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a lot, I compare it to the airlines, right? You can go to websites and get last minute tickets, right, to fill seats. At the last minute, they'll sell a seat for a lot under what they would sell a seat for normally, so that they can fill that flight and maximize occupancy. What we're kind of trying to do is maximize occupancy a little bit in a way that's meaningful. At some point, there's a step variable to it, and it might make sense to make cuts, but we're trying to continue to have those conversations. We aren't a business. If we wanted to treat it like a business, there's a lot of things we could do that would curl the hair on your toes, but we don't do those things because that's not why we're here.
What Patrick said makes a lot of sense. I mean, honestly, I think an AP class with 12 kids in it would be amazing versus one late You're getting that much more time one-on-one with the teacher. So, I mean,
But I think to his point, if we had an AP class with 5 kids in it, is it really, I mean, it's good for some students, but, is it really, does it make sense?
right, those are numbers worth looking at though, I think.
So I'd say that one of the things that we look at when we look at school choices, with the exception of last year where we accepted an additional 40 school choice kids, every year we basically ask the principal of the high school, Mr. Hale, to weigh in on what number of school choice kids does he think that the school would be able to absorb in which it would not impact the budget, and we would not need to add positions. So if we excluded the number of students that we added last year, in which we got an additional 200,000, 100,000 of which went to support an assistant principal position here, if we exclude last year and look back, I think what we'll find is that there really isn't a cost savings in terms of reducing positions, but to Aaron's point, it really comes down to, when we look at things, we can look at things as in very broad, very focused lenses, but we have to consider the system as a whole. So when we think of school choice and bringing in 20 school choice kids, let's say at the elementary level, you could say, well, if you got rid of school choice, you could get rid of, a classroom. Well, it doesn't necessarily work that way. If we lose 100 kids, those 100 kids are spread out over, over 12 grades. And so you're not seeing, you're seeing, a reduction of basically 8 kids per class. So not enough to reduce positions. At some point, yes, the number of students will decrease. When we talk about school choice, we're talking about just the opposite effect, where we're adding enough students to be able to maximize class sizes, but without necessarily adding positions and adding to the bottom line of the budget.
Phil, how many kids are actually in a class? What's the average for kids in a class?
What grade?
Just in general, is there like an average,
So it can vary. It can vary. At the elementary school level, we've tried very hard to keep numbers at 21, 22 for the lower grades. We can go up to 24, 25. We got up into the higher elementary grades. But once you get into middle school and high school, obviously there's more variability, right? Because you may not have 25 kids that want to take AP Physics. You may have 16. So it's really hard to tell, what the average is. If you wanted to know a rough average, you could just take the number of students and divide it by the number of teachers and the number of classes that are offered. But it's an unrealistic comparison, really.
I think there's a thought experiment you can conduct along those lines around coming to a model. I think the easiest place to model this would be elementary, because students are in the classroom with the teacher all day long. At the high school, they go all over the place, and it's hard to predict where they would end up. But to your point, the most cost-saving model would be, for example, if for some reason there was 20 fewer students in a school in a grade level, right, which would allow you to eliminate a class. However, if even in that situation, if you made 20 choice seats in that classroom, it's $100,000. So, it seems like it would probably work out in the most extreme case. So I think that in many of the other cases, it also is economical.
Patrick, before you move on, just a quick point. When you were talking about the number of teachers per 100 students and the number of paras per 100 students, you got to understand that a paraprofessional is probably half, 1/5, depending on what year the teacher is, or the pay of the teacher. So adding them up together and counting them as one is
Well, I think that's why you need to model it, to see what's the most economic way to deliver. And it may be that we're delivering the most economic model.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I was like, we have lower on the teacher and higher on the para. It kind of makes sense because that's probably a cheaper option.
It could balance out. I just think the numbers beg the question to see what can we learn.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up. Thank you.
The other points, interesting to see Dayton Rehoboth, right? So Rehoboth 65%, Dayton's 35%. Rehoboth voted 3 times in 2019 to exit a full regional agreement and move to K-8 because they did the math and said it actually made more sense based on what was being paid. So I know the charge has been to look at school configuration to the group, and I am not encouraging it, but what do the numbers say? Is that a better option for Hamden Wilbraham to potentially look at not just building configuration, but potentially regional versus Seoul based off that? Now, important to say, the state rejected Rehoboth's 3 votes and said no, and then took over their budget, which has been a nightmare since 2019. The other piece, when we look at it from Whitman-Hanson, interesting to see, if you look at both of them, their percentage this year in the 8s, right? And so what they have said is the special ed is the difference between the special ed increase is an 8% and a 3%. So I would say kudos to you for not taking that approach of just saying, all right, we're gonna ask for it because of the 14%, that's what we need. So thank you for being fiscally responsible there. Last one is just a request or recommendation for the future. So curriculum councils, if I'm not mistaken, we voted on it. We were told that that would be funded by ESSER. And the equity audit, when that was done, we were told that that was being funded by ESSER. Never once was there a mention of the fact that we would have to cover it in the budget moving forward, and I recognize that one is outcomes versus the audit itself, and it's $75,000 out of a $53 million budget, so we don't need to lose sleep on it. I would just encourage us in the future to say, we expect ongoing expenses of A, B, C, or D, and those are going to come from the operating budget, which is funded elsewhere.
So the commitment I made was to fund the equity audit itself, the actual audit from ESSER. The outcomes of that may go on for 20 years. ESSER ends at the end of 2025. I don't. The curriculum councils, we have funding, again, for ESSER through 2025. We could, we're trying to responsibly put them into the budget so they're an active part of the budget. We could offset those with ESSER if we really needed to. Again, we're trying to make sure it's clear that this is an ongoing cost and really should be part of the budget if we're embedding it in what we do in the long term strategically.
Yeah, right, we did the same thing with the strategic plan, right? Here's what it is, and oh, by the way, it ended up costing more than that because we put positions to it. But when we're being asked to do something like that, I would just encourage we would expect an ongoing cost of whatever that may be so that everyone's voting with eyes wide open.
And just a quick point too, and you did bring it up yourself, Patrick, deregionalization is only an option if DESE approves it, and if they don't, it can be devastating, which you brought up the example of. I just wonder
well, the historical perspective on deregionalization in the Commonwealth is it basically, in my conversations with MASC, it's only happened once in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it was in a district that was expanding rapidly, and the two towns had enough to be able to support their own schools. In most cases, you have diminishing enrollments, and so the likelihood that DESE would ever get stamp of approval on that is pretty much approaching zero.
Sorry, one point of question. You just alluded to ESSER funds ending at the end of 25. Where are ESSER funds being applied in 2024?
So we have $350,000 supporting the budget in ESSER. That will go away at the end of, end of 2024 ESSER funds end, I'm sorry. So it will end at the end of next year. I'm sorry, I misspoke.
So when you referenced positions ending, let's see, there's a note in here about losing, I got 3 full-time employees in terms of student support.
Yes.
It appeared to me that was in 2024, not after 2024.
Yes, so those 3.5 positions are part of our plan going forward. So so $350,000 is being used to support the core budget itself. Beyond the budget, we hired a number of social emotional staff to help with the return to full in-person learning when we did that. So we committed to keep them on. We started them in January of last year. We committed to keep them on through the end of this year. And we're expecting that, as some of them, they're effectively, sort of long-term substitute type positions. As people leave the district, they might fill positions that exist. They might find positions elsewhere. Normal attrition might change some things with that.
So you have 3.5 positions that will end in the current academic year and won't be replaced in the budget as it stands for 2020?
Yes, they will not be replaced in the budget. Yep. Yep.
I'm sitting here kind of listening and talking about some of the comparative districts, some of the comparative districts we're talking about, Rehoboth and Lakeville and Whitman and so forth, and talk about the percentage increases.
Sure.
Well, I took a quick look, and, from the finance committee, I'm always looking at, well, what is going to be the ramifications to the Wilbraham voters, and where we're sitting with that. I took a look at their mill rates. They're not even remotely comparison to ours. As an example, Rehoboth is at 11.
Mm-hmm.
We're nearly double that.
Sure.
And Freetown's at 10.
Yep.
So when it comes down to what that impact is really going to be to the voter, but to the taxpayers, while educationally it might be apples to apples, financially, on the taxpayers, it's not apples to apples. It's a different.
I think the point I'm trying to make is their cost structures are similar. So the items that are very non-controllable, that typically go up significantly and have gone up significantly over the past few years. When I talk about health insurance, it's a fluke that our health insurance is as low as it is this year. It's usually 7%, right? In a municipal district, the town would be picking up that health insurance. So in a regional district, you have to factor for the fact that the regional district is picking up that very significant health insurance cost. All of the OPEB costs, the retiree health insurance, again, intrinsically tied to our health insurance costs. Those rates go up linear to our regular health insurance. I think I shared our pension costs last year went up by over 9%. This year, it's Hampden County. This year, they're going up by over 5%. So again, those are items that a municipal school district would be picking up. So I'm really just trying to share the reality of being a regional school district as opposed to a municipal school district. So if this was just Wilbraham schools, Wilbraham would be absorbing those costs like it or not.
Well, and that's it, I understand that. I mean,
Okay.
you can see that, but, when you kind of look at everything apples to apples.
Sure.
Because what we're looking at is, what are our tax bills going to look like going forward? And,
right.
When you're looking at a 10% mill rate, that increase, it's a lot different than,
Yep. So I think we shared with the finance committee when John and I came that we're preparing in the worst case scenario to cut up to 30 jobs. I mean that's the reality. I mean that if we're going to compare it to those districts, the reality is this district may shed 30 jobs. That's just a fact.
Yeah, the pie is only so big.
The
pie is only so big.
Exactly. I've said it many times and I agree with it. Absolutely correct.
Patrick would just share a thought with me that was something that we brought up, I think it was last year, when you look at the top mill rates in the state of Massachusetts. I think it's in 48 out of 50 of the towns that have the highest mill rates were all west of the 495 Beltway. So I mean, it's just the reality of where we live and the lack of industrial support that we have.
I do just want to factor in the fact that while the tax rate is certainly important, it's also, the denominator is the assessed value. So if your assessed values are vastly higher out east, which I think they are, then yes, they're going to have a lower tax rate because the denominator is a much bigger number.
Correct.
As you look at the total tax obligated of the community.
I think, and that would go to the average income in that region too. If you start looking at that, you're going to see a much higher income to support that. So again, that puts us even more behind the eight ball.
Well, so you said Rehoboth's 118,000, but it's 96,000, which isn't that far off of where we are. So it does beg the question, which they're going to get into services are they getting for 10%, because that's pretty crazy.
But to Aaron's point, I think what we're trying to, I think what he was trying to get across is that, regardless, regional school districts are absorbing very, very high costs, and those are being passed on to the taxpayers. So regardless of what your mill rate is, it doesn't change the fact that there's a cost to education, and it's going up across the state. And whether our mill rate's 10 or our mill rate's 22, we still have to account for that increase.
Okay, thank you. So I believe that we've covered transportation in the Lower Pioneer Valley conversation, as well as the capital planning needs and CPA applications. Does that make sense? Would you like to add?
I just have one thing to add about transportation. As I've been notifying the committee as well as the FinCom, I have been working with LVPEC to see if there are any cost savings available through a different model. I did get communication from the collaborative just shortly before this meeting indicating that a 3-tier model might result in a cost savings of $160,000. Obviously, I think I would like to investigate that a little bit more in terms of finding out what that would do for start and end times, but I think in terms of trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible, it's important to take a look at that option.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to the TWB closure discussion.
So we have been working on numbers for what it would cost us to close TWB and move out of that building. I've been working with Dave Rogers and Mike Messier to come up with some numbers. We will put an official cost estimate out for the next school committee meeting, but we are looking somewhere in the range of $175,000 to $200,000 to do the work necessary to build out office space appropriate to the needs and conduct the actual physical moves. Now, I'd like to also remind the folks in this room that that does not stop the fact that we have a lease with the town of Hamden, and we are mandated to continue a degree of service in that building. That includes maintaining it at an operating level. It means continuing to mow the lawn, it means continuing to plow, keep the heat on, and the lights functioning. So that will not mitigate all of the costs.
What is the office space built up? So my understanding is the individuals that are sitting in that building now, when this building opened, that department was housed in the district offices. So what needs to be built out and what has changed since 2012 other than?
I wasn't here when that existed, so I'm not going to speak to that, but. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
So student services was located in central office. Student services is composed of, I have 3 administrative assistants, and then I have an office, but since we left, the offices have been built out, and they're now occupied by like human resources and other staff members that needed a degree of privacy, so they are now in that office space.
So what's the solution if you move out of TWB?
So, some of what we're looking at is Steve Hale offered some space in one of the rooms up here as a potential space for special education. We would build out an office in that space, as well as cubicles in that space. We also have to look into putting a mini split in that space. Those people would be here all summer and would require air conditioning for that purpose.
Was that included in your $175,000?
Yes, the cost to save mini split would be included in that. That's part of that. It would include building out walls, building out a private office with walls, electrical, HVAC, lighting, things like that. The lighting, if you go into these rooms, the lights go kind of end to end. The vents are built to cover the entire room, so we may need to try to re-vent that space. Outlets are against the wall. We may need to re-outlet some space. We don't know exactly where every group is going to go, so we have a number of additional people who are in that building. I don't know where they may have been before. So we have Gina Kahn, her staff. We have our nurse leader, our nursing director, as well as someone else that sits with them. So we're looking at, probably building out, 2 or 3 classrooms in the office space minimally. We also have the person who does our community outreach and the food pantry we've begun. We've need somewhere to move that, that would be a lower cost move. That person would need a built-out office and would need, you know, open space, but there would be moving costs associated with that.
So we're in the process of implementing a strategic plan of which building utilization is certainly one of the discussions. I recall, you know, when we had discussions about closing TWB several years ago and where people were going to go. The biggest thing that I see is I don't want to start walking down a path and then have to walk back the same path to go in a different direction. And my hesitation is that if we rush to close TWB, we build out this office space, and then through the strategic planning process, we find that there is need for more space for students in the school. We may end up backing out of those construction projects in order to do that. And you know, one of the criticisms that I hear in town from people is you know, why aren't we thinking 5 years ahead? The example that was given to me, which makes sense, is we talked about the addition on the fire station, and then several years later we went back and we did the police station. You know, why wasn't that combined? So I just want to have some forward-thinking logic on this and make sure that we understand that anything that we build, if we end up having to reuse that space, we're going to have to deconstruct it, and not only are we paying for the construction costs, but then we're paying for the demolition and reconstruction costs.
So,
Or we don't do construction.
Or we don't do construction.
Aaron, you had mentioned before, as far as the lease associated with TWB, have you even preliminarily had any conversations with Hampton on their willingness to work with you on exiting that?
we've not had that conversation yet.
So we don't know what.
We don't know what they, I do understand, I mean, they do utilize that building pretty significantly. So, thank you.
And I believe that lease is a 20-year lease that was signed in 2015, so it'll carry us until 2035.
All right, we'll move on to the capital stabilization fund discussion.
Yeah, so we've had this discussion at the Finance and Operations Subcommittee level, and we thought it was appropriate to bring this discussion to you all. Because this building is unique in all of the buildings in the district in that it has a separate stabilization fund. As Aaron alluded to, there's roughly $408,000 that is in that fund every year. The district tries to put some money into that fund. And one of the discussions that we've had is what exactly qualifies as an expense which would qualify it for being pulled from that fund. And I think everybody has different opinions as far as what it is. The idea of the fund, and Mark, so you can help me with this, but it was when the building was built, it was a fund that was set up in order to cover the cost of ongoing maintenance of the building. Does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, Sue and Doug can speak to this as well, but I mean, one of the real issues, sorry.
As I was saying, Sue and Doug can speak to this as well. One of the real reasons, or one of the major complaints we had heard at the time this building was being considered was, why do we have to build a new building? Is it because we didn't maintain the old building properly? And so we made a commitment to the taxpayer at that point, or the residents of the towns, that we would maintain this building in a different format. And so we set up this capital stabilization account largely as a maintenance account to ensure it was properly maintained. Now, whether or not we're funding it adequately is a discussion we can have. I think many in this room would probably think not. But I think that's the whole point of that. So how you want to use it, I think is up to the school committee's decision, but I think the original purpose of it was as a maintenance fund for projects that were needed to maintain this building properly. I would think it's, in my own opinion, it's not to enhance the building, but it's to keep what we have and to maintain it properly.
So would that be like roof, windows, parking lot? Is that what you mean by that? Maintaining what we have?
Yeah, I mean, maintain what we have. It isn't to add an addition to the building or to add classrooms or to change classrooms into offices. Those sorts of things are not that. I mean, but I don't, that's my opinion.
So I think one of the discussions that we had, and Doug, I'll let you dovetail on this because I know this was something that came up, was, you know, when we talk about maintenance of the building, we talk about things that have a lifespan, right? A roof has a lifespan, windows and doors have a lifespan. Where does, you know, where do we decide what that lifespan is? What qualifies as something that is a maintenance issue for the building versus something that may not be?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up with Mark's comment, the criticism that was heard loud and clear by the building committee from both towns was that we collectively had not maintained the old high school. That as a result of deferred maintenance year after year, all of the major systems in that building were deficient. And Mike, you were here at the time, yes. I mean, when I say all of the systems, I mean, the old pool had the crash bars padlock closed. I mean, horribly incorrect. So the agreement was, and you know, it's really a matter of keeping faith with the residents and the taxpayers of the town, that we will maintain this building. We won't allow the same thing to occur here that happened to the old Minichog. So it's not so much maintenance in the sense of the ordinary day-to-day. It was more the significant system issues, doors, windows, roofs, parking lots, you know, water systems, electrical, you know, HVAC. Now, you know, we didn't define what those projects would be. I mean, arguably, you could put the computer network systems into that category as well. It's been a significant ongoing expense. But I think the spirit of that fund is to avoid this building falling behind in its physical condition, such that it gets to the same point. I mean, none of us will be around the table when these decisions are made. But the time will come when the decisions are made about this building. Do you tear it down and build a new one, or do you fix it up? And what we were trying to accomplish with this fund was creating a commitment year after year. It keeps it front and center. This building has to be maintained so that it does not meet the same fate that the old Minichog had.
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that was shocking to the townspeople at the time was when the volleyball game hit the ball and the ball crashed the outer wall and rolled into the parking lot. That was like the icing on the cake that really showed we had not been doing due diligence.
I don't mean to be pointing fingers, because I mean, I was involved with that as well. I mean, I was involved in developing budgets 25 and 30 years ago.
Yeah, I'm talking we.
Lots of people around this table. I mean, it's a matter of avoiding the pattern of the past that created the problem. And so while it's easy to dip into this $400,000 and take care of these short-term issues, that was not the intent of this fund. This is a matter of keeping it front and center. It has to be a commitment. There's never an extra $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 to set into a set-aside fund. But it has to be done, I would suggest.
Can we take a recommendation to send it to policy subcommittee to come up with a recommended policy, hearing those that were involved in its inception, the spirit and the intent behind this would be appropriate? Does that work for everybody?
Do we want to talk about how woefully underfunded it is? Because if you look at a roof...
For a $100 million budget to have $400,000 set aside, I would say that it's probably,
to say it's significantly underfunded would be a vast understatement.
It's underfunded, unquestionably, because it's the same issue as maintenance being deferred. I mean, we collectively have underfunded that capital account since it was created. I mean, a realistic number would be probably more in the neighborhood of 100, 150,000 a year in order for that to build to a substantial enough figure to actually deal with capital items as they come up.
Well, actually, we were talking about that a little bit. I don't know if you had gone to your advisory meeting, but I mean, if you look at the value of this building and you look at what the predicted lifespan of this building is, and the lifespan of a school building in Massachusetts is about 50 years. So if you're looking at, you know, at maintaining the building replacement costs, you're looking at $2 million a year over 20 years. I'm sorry, $2 million a year over 50 years, so $100 million.
But it's deferred, it would be
Deferred maintenance.
It wouldn't be the.
Would be the replacement cost.
You're looking at a different depreciation schedule.
In 50 years, though, you probably have to put 3 roofs on.
At least
And
2.
the roof of this building is probably 700 to $1 million.
I made the point,
2 million for the middle school.
I made the point in the last meeting we had that I've never seen this, and I'd love to see it, because I think it's as true for town buildings as it is for this building. I would love to see some sort of projected costs, some model that specified what would be the maintenance cost of it, what would be the expected maintenance cost on a long-term basis for this building. And then you could, there must be some sort of model out there for this, and I don't know what it is, because it's not just this building, it's, I think, all town buildings, right?
We are endeavoring to build that in our 10-year capital plan that we've shared, that has many of the items we're talking about in it, moving forward.
Why do we need to build it? I get it, it's got to exist somewhere. It has to exist. There has to be some model out there. Whether it's a corporation who does it, they must figure this out. They must know this, what the expected costs are.
So Mark, the state of Massachusetts actually provides a guide with recommended anticipated maintenance costs for municipal buildings. I spent a little bit of time reading into it last year, because it's public. Anyway, I wanted to try to get a feel for, you know, I saw the amount of money that was going into that fund, and I was like, gee whiz, you know, it cost us like, you know, $60 million to build a high school, is that enough? And I actually ended up, when I went through that guide and stuff, I came to a number that was something like $2 million a year. But I mean, we've been in a honeymoon period, right? The building was new, so, you know, when something's new, you know, things aren't breaking until they are, and things are starting to work, right? The network switches, the light switches, you know, these little things, and then, you know, more things will come down the road. So I think you guys are all, I applaud you, I think you were thinking along the right lines, right? We can't go from putting, you know, $40,000, $400,000 in the account to $2 million in the account in 1 year, right? Because the budget, we're choking stuff, but I think there needs to be a subcommittee and, you know, a reasonable plan to gradually over the years step that up, because the costs for maintaining this building expectedly are going to step up to, you know, what that is. And I'm sure that there are people here that are much more experienced with this, that are familiar with this guidance and the state stuff, and would be able to interpret it better than me. But
it would be nice to get a piece of granite and sort of chisel it into stone that this discussion was had at this meeting tonight at this particular time, because in 20 years, as Doug had said, 20 years ago, he was having these discussions, and, you know, there are licenses. I can tell you that the biggest expenses for this building, the roof, the parking lot, I mean, those are the things, and then your heating and cooling systems. Yeah.
Maybe in 20 years, they'll flying cars, they won't leave the parking lot.
And we would hope. Windows and doors.
And you're always going to be up against the needs of the operating budget and the desire to provide the highest quality education that you can with the dollars that are available. So, you know, I mean, the reason we are where we are from an infrastructure perspective, Doug and I were both on these committees in the 80s or in the 90s when we said, well, you know, we don't have to do it this year, we don't have to do that this year, and here we are 30 years later, wishing we had done some of those things.
Well, this was a monumental task in town. Don't forget, every school building that we have in our district, with the exception of this building, was built from 1968 or prior. So, and that includes Memorial. I think the only school that was built earlier was the Pine School, but Memorial was 1950. I believe Mount Street was 63. The old Minnechaug was 72. I'm sorry, no, it wasn't. I'm sorry, it was 52. They added the addition of 72. But all of the school buildings that we have, Thornton Burgess 67, WMS 68, so this was a monumental move. And I mean, looking at where we are now in terms of capital needs, I mean, we have 60 years of use on those buildings since they were built. And so, you know, coming down the pike, we're looking at, again, usable life of a municipal building. You know, we're past that if we're looking at 50 years. So, you know, it's definitely not an easy problem to solve. You know, in capital expenses, just maintaining our buildings that we have are significant. And then we have a building that's 50 years newer, but we know that at some point those costs, as you know, as we alluded to, those are going to accelerate. And in 15 more years, you're going to be looking at a roof. Another 10 years, 12 years, you might be looking at a parking lot.
But is it desirable for the towns to have us start putting money away now above and beyond our budget? Or is it better for in 5 years when we need to do the roof, in maybe 10 years when we need to do the parking lot, to come to you and say, you know, now we have to pay this budget? I mean,
but I think Sean's point is basically, is the fund, I mean, would the fund be more, I think, more symbolic versus functional?
Right.
Because the cost of replacing a parking lot in this building is $3 million.
We're going to need $6 million within the next 10 years inside that fund in order to fund the projects that are going to come due.
I don't disagree, but I think what that fund accomplishes is it keeps the issue of the long-term maintenance of this building on the table. I mean, for every certain amount of money that's put into that fund, that's one position that's not being funded.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a cost to it.
Right.
But that's a recognition of the fact that having a piece of property like this has a cost. I mean, it's not just the debt service. There's an ongoing, never-ending cost of this building. And as uncomfortable as it may be to put money into that fund, I would suggest it's necessary. Now, when the time comes, well, you know, whether it's the roof or the parking lot or whatever it is, there'll be enough money in that fund to do the preliminary assessment that'll be necessary. No, there will be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there'll be enough to do the preliminary assessment, to come up with the entire plan, to then come back to the towns for the full vote. Right.
Okay, then if that's what I think we were looking for, then that is the definition of what this fund is. It's not to fund the parking lot, fund the new roof, fund the new windows, fund the new HVAC. It's to have us in a position where we can get the information together on what the actual cost will be and to bring it to the town.
It's going to require an engineering study, an architectural, there'll have to be significant costs associated with whatever the project is.
And it will provide some ownership on the district level. For those projects that are coming due.
Our policies of chairs taking copious notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So number 9.
Thank you, Mara.
Discussing the budget recap to the towns. Can you speak just quickly?
Yeah. So every year since, you know, I think this is the 8th year on finance and operations. I think it's the 4th or 5th year that Mr. Doozy has been on there. And you know, one of the things that I think we can do better at is giving a budget recap to advisory and finance to both towns. Basically, it's a summary of when we did the budget. These were the projected impacts on the education of our students. But getting into as we roll into the next fiscal year, sort of looking realistically at what exactly was impacted and how did we cope with that. And I think that's a very good recommendation, and I think that it's a responsibility of the school committee to be able to adequately inform. So rather than every year as we come and we said, you know, well, we needed this much money and you gave us the money, but what did we do with it? And how did it turn out? And you know, if we had done things differently, if there was more money in the budget, how would we have done things differently? If there was less money in the budget, what would have been the impact? And then to look real time at, you know, what happened in that fiscal year with the budget that we had. So I think I think that's a great idea. I would suggest we talk, kind of get on ideas for meetings. I would suggest somewhere around September, October. We won't have the final numbers because our audit isn't done until the end of the year, but I think it'll give us a good idea of rolling into the next school year, how we did.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the strategic planning update.
Sure, just very briefly, as I already mentioned earlier in the evening, the website review and evaluation team is meeting with a number of vendors to try to find a new solution that'll give our district the website it deserves, and our communities the website that our district should have. Hopefully I'll have some decisions to report soon on that. And also, as I've also said, we're really in full swing with equity audit right now. I know that's a very important goal for the strategic plan and for the school committee. And this month, it's many hours every day that is going to providing the documents needed for that, not just by my office, but for the administrators across the district. So I will be sharing with you more about the information that the auditor has requested. Finally, I'll just use this opportunity to say also in the next several weeks, there will be 7 surveys going out related to the equity audit, so everyone will have an opportunity to participate. There's one for school committee members, there's one for central office staff, there's one for district administrators, there's one for the staff of the district, as well as families of the district, community members, and students in grades 6 through 12. So I'm just taking this opportunity to say, be on the lookout for lots of surveys in the next several weeks.
Who will they be coming from?
They'll be coming from my office. They'll be on, they'll be clearly labeled as Mass Insight Equity Audit documents.
I assume you'll have a series of robocalls that will be going out as well to sort of keep people on tablet.
Absolutely.
People have a tendency to, they swipe through your email, they scroll and swipe right. So.
Thank you everyone for being here this evening. We appreciate your attendance. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Sure.
Second.
Okay, so we roll call vote. Go.
Aye.
Cheryl? John?
Aye.
Okay. Lisa? Aye. Maura? Aye. Myself, aye. We are adjourned. 8:57.
Can I encourage student members to
Yep.
sign warrants?
Yep. Okay.
That's done.
So we're going to find
It started over here, and I didn't finish it.
We're going to have finance